Hello and welcome. This is Captain Tom, and yeah, welcome aboard the Silverwind. I am joined by my co-host and producer, intergalactic robot Wilson. And yeah, so with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about Genesis chapter 22 today, where it's kind of the culmination of everything that we've been talking about with Abraham's story. So this is going to be a lot of fun, and there's a big question we're going to tackle today, and that is what is faith, right? So the idea or concept of faith, what comes to mind for you guys? Is that something that or just, I guess, think that to yourself? You can remark in the chat. But when you hear the word faith, what do you think of? For a lot of people, it's just a religious term. But yeah, we're going to talk about that today and explain it by what it actually is and how it really applies to the story. And then, of course, we're going to go somewhere interesting today. We're going to go to a galaxy called, make sure I get this right, NG1672. I'm sorry, NGC 1672. They really should come up with better names, but I understand there's lots of galaxies, so eventually you just start numbering them all. So we're gonna go there. Let's make that happen here. First off, we got Dan Yoder. Heck yeah, so everyone, let's go. And this guy. So I tried to do something interesting here, see if this works. I tried to get a chat box going on here, and Wilson said it was up to me to make sure I could put it in there. Let me see if this works real quick. Nope, does not work apparently. All right, so I'll have to work on that. Eventually I have a little working chat box in here. It'll be fun and interesting. But with that, let's go ahead. We'll change the camera a little bit, and we will head on over to a new galaxy. And it's got some it's very similar to this galaxy in a lot of ways, but looks really cool. It's kind of fun to go out there and see these different things. It's a barred galaxy, not too dissimilar from the Milky Way. And for a lot of people may not know what a barred galaxy is. Let's see here, make sure we go in here. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. So yeah, let's see here. Let me go here and we'll be ready for it. Perfect. Okay, so a barred galaxy, as you're going to see with this, it's a galaxy that the spiral doesn't go all the way to the center. So oftentimes when you think of a spiraled galaxy, you think of, well, something that's completely spiraled out, right? But with a barred galaxy, there's actually a bar of stars that goes from the center, and there's a bar that extends on both sides, and then the spiral starts at the end of those bars. And they believe that that happens mainly because, oh yeah, here we are. It's a little bright. Wilson, could you turn on the infrared? Makes it a little easier to see here, but that's the nucleus right there. This is here we go. Look at that. Oh, that was looked so much better. Perfect. Let's do this. Make sure we stay in one space. Easy day. All right. That should be good. Okay. Look at that. We could just, here we go. There we go. Look at that. Just bounce between the two. So perfect. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and, yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and jump to our story. There's really not much to say about the galaxy other than the little stuff we kind of know about them. It's theorized that these developed over, billions or millions of years, and that this bar right here, as you can see, if you look up top right here and you look out to the right, it just had this straight line of basically gas and stars. The idea is that these basically kind of all formed early, and they all formed very close to one another. So it just stays, keeps a bar because they're kind of held together by gravity. And then the stuff that gets on the outside that's spiraled is a little less affected by that. But yeah, anyways, that's where it is. And it's going to be a nice background for our story today. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right into it. Let's jump into that transition scene. I will see you guys in the library. Nice. Okay, that is gorgeous. Let's go ahead and bring it in a little bit. Okay, so today, like I said, we're going to be covering Genesis chapter 22. This is a big pivotal moment in this story, especially when we're talking about Abraham. So over the course of this story, we can, doing a little bit of recap because it's important for this. Abraham is someone who has been, well, we would say, a man of faith. He was called to go to a country that he didn't know, that he'd be a foreigner in, and promised land in this place by, God, essentially God speaking to him and telling them this, and on faith alone, he goes out to that new land. And that's it's a pretty wild and amazing thing to do. There's a lot of fears in a situation like that, a lot of unknown, but he just sets out anyways. And so when he gets there, one of the big problems that Abraham has is that him and Sarah do not have any kids. Sarah is unable to have children. And so that basically creates this big dilemma to where his entire household will then go to essentially the next person in charge, right? But it's not going to be his descendants. And that's kind of it was a very depressing thought for him. And he really wanted basically a lineage, right? He wanted children and something to pass everything down to. A very legit thing to want in life. God does promise to give this to him. And for 25 years, he basically is waiting for the fulfillment of this promise. A bunch of stuff happens in the middle of all that. We have moments where we see Abraham really lacking in faith, fearing for his own safety, and then just doing things that he thought was clever. But in the end, he just kind of gets rebuked for doing it, and it ends up causing a lot of problems in his life, such as when he lied in Egypt about who Sarah was to him. She is technically his sister, his half-sister, but he denied that she was his wife. And so Pharaoh tried to marry her, caused a lot of problems. But in the middle of all of that, he ended up getting a bunch of gifts, male and female Egyptian servants being one of them. And one of these female servants, his name is Hagar. And then this basically creates a lot of problems in their household. So with that issue, he didn't really do too much with he didn't really do the right thing when he was offered by Sarah to take Hagar and have a kid through her. It was obvious that Sarah was going through a difficult time. It was very obvious. She has a lot of self-loathing in the statement saying, well, God has left me out of the promise, this, that, and the other. And Abraham takes her up on her offer to do this thing simply because he wants a son, for no other reason. It's not like he was tempted by Hagar's beauty or anything like that. He clearly doesn't really seem to, care too much about Hagar in the story when Hagar is being mistreated, or when Hagar is essentially annoying Sarah from Sarah's perspective. And Sarah complains to Abraham. He's just like, listen, you can, do whatever with her. She's your servant. It's like, I don't care what you do with Hagar. And so, it creates a lot of problems, right? God has to intervene and fix things, but we see Abraham go back and forth between some low points like that and high points where he goes to rescue Lot. He saves Lot from essentially the world-ending army, the first true world war that happened at that day and age. And he was the only one who was able to defeat the army, right? Did that fully on faith, and of course, God was with him. And we see a lot of other moments as well. So God's been working on Abraham. He's made a covenant with him. And now we've gotten to a point where he finally has a son through Sarah. And the son is Isaac. In the last chapter, he had to essentially cast out Hagar and Ishmael. Ishmael was his first son through Hagar. Because they're not included in the promise that God has for this covenant that he's made with Abraham. And so God made it very clear this is going to be through Isaac, right? So that's kind of where we're at in the story. So he's has this miraculous son through Sarah in her old age. This 25-year-long promise has finally been made and or been fulfilled by God the right way. So now we think, okay, well, the story's over, right? Shouldn't we just move on to the next generation? There's actually a really important part of this story that's going to culminate all of this together. So that's what we're covering today. And let's see here. We have faith is a tension between what is known and expected, and expectation that is outside of our control. I think that's actually a really good definition for that. That's actually pretty good. Nice. There's going to be a Hebrew definition I'll read later, which I think pretty much lines up with everything that you're saying. So yeah, it's pretty good. I'm not sure how to say that name, but yeah, let's go ahead and jump into the story here. I think we're just going to start off with the first couple of verses. Now that we're kind of all caught up with where we are at, and we'll just move forward from there. So with that, let's go ahead and start in chapter 1. Here we go. All right, chapter 1, chapter 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. "Abraham," God called out. "Yes," he replied, "here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will show you." Well, that's pretty problematic, right? I mean, so this is taking a very hard turn. God is, it's just saying right here at the beginning, this is going to be a test of faith. Of course, God isn't saying that to him. God just simply commands him to go to a very specific place. Moriah sounds very Tolkienish. Tolkien didn't get Moriah from that, but yeah, the land of Moriah. And so he's being told to sacrifice his son Isaac there. Now, in the previous chapter, God specifically tells him this. It's going to be in verse 12 of chapter 21. I'm just going to read it. It says here, "For Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted." God is very clear and direct what his intentions are with Isaac, that Isaac will live to have to have descendants, and the many descendants will come through Isaac. This promise of the covenant will happen through that. And now God, sometime later, is now telling him to sacrifice Isaac. So this creates an issue of faith. Is Abraham going to believe what God said earlier? And how does that going to make sense with the situation? So it's a very interesting dilemma that Abraham is in. It's also very interesting to note that in the land of Canaan, it gets even worse later, but it's probably happening at this time as well. Sacrificing, like doing human sacrifices, was kind of a norm of the time, right? This is something that we find out later. Canaan really gets into the practice of it, where they're sacrificing their own firstborn children and things like that. So this command that God is giving him is probably something that probably sounds like, the current culture and day that God is asking him to do. And surely Abraham understands God to be different from those deities. So we'll see how God responds with this. Well, I guess we'll see how Abraham responds with this. So yeah, let's just go ahead and jump to this next part right here, and we'll just kind of continue on talking about the obedience and faith a little bit. All right. The next morning, Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac. Then he chopped wood for a fire and burnt offering, and set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day of the journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. "Stay here with the donkey," Abraham told the servants. "The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back." Okay, so I wanted to get to this part before we started talking about faith. So one way of looking at the story, and one of the things that God will essentially point out later, is his obedience. So there's 2 things basically happening right here. Abraham's obedience to God is being tested, and his faith is being tested. His obedience is obviously being tested because he is, basically worshiping God. God is his Lord. That's how he addresses God. And as his Lord, will he do what God says? The other aspect is that God has promised something, and now we have the situation where he doesn't know how God is going to come through with his promise now that he's asking him to sacrifice his son. So he has to have hope in something that is yet unseen. And so I want to look at JR's comment right here. Faith is a tension between what is known and expectation that is outside of our control. I really like that definition. I think that's actually a really good one. I'm going to read this Hebrew definition real quick, I guess it's in Hebrew chapter 11, verse 1. I think it's very paralleled with what you're saying here. So it says this: faith is the confidence that, sorry, let me start it again. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives assurance about things we cannot see. So essentially, like, hope for something that is yet unseen, right? Believing that it will come to pass. And there is definitely a tension there between what is known. So right now, what Abraham knows is that God has promised his covenant through Isaac, and that he also knows God is telling him to sacrifice him. And so he tells the servants, we kind of get an insight into Abraham's mind here, because it doesn't really like go into his perspective much, but he's telling the servants that, hey, you know, me and the boy are going to go up, do this sacrifice, and then we're both going to come back. Like, it shows, I don't think that he's just lying. I don't think that's the way the story is meant to be read right here. So every part of the story is written out. The things that are included here are very important, right? So if it's just him lying to cover it up, it doesn't really, you know, make sense for anything else that happens in this chapter. The only thing that really makes sense when you look at the whole story is that he truly believes what he's telling his servants here. He truly believes, yes, he's going to come back down with Isaac. Now, we have no insight into his mindset and why he believes this. Maybe he doesn't know how God is going to make it happen, but he seems to have faith that even if he goes through with what God is telling him to do, that he still will have Isaac, and Isaac will still be the one through the God has promised, you know, this covenant, and you know, the people from, or his descendants through. So it's it's kind of interesting to see that he's, you know, seems very confident that, hey, no, we're both going to come back down. So just wait here with the donkeys. Another way of looking at this is that he doesn't want the servants to be there. Maybe he doesn't want to have to explain it to them and start a conversation about that. He just wants this to be private between him and Isaac and God. So, all right, well, we'll go a little bit further right here. And let's we'll get another good chunk right now. All right. See here. Yep. We will worship here, and then we will come right back. So this is going to be verse 8. So verse 6. So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them walked on together, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "We have the fire and the wood," the boy said. But where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" "God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son," Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. When they arrived at the place where God had told them to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. And we'll stop at that tension right there. So we have kind of a little bit of repetition here. We have a second time where Abraham asserts, this time to Isaac, that God will provide, right? So this seems to be where Abraham's mindset is at, that somehow, some way, maybe God will raise Isaac back from the dead. Whatever the case is, somehow, some way, God will provide. And it's a pretty remarkable thing. Now, one thing I wanted to bring up with this, so you might see what he's doing here and say, well, he's just kind of blindly following what God is asking him to do, because surely if God told me to do this, I would say, mind your own business, or absolutely not, or something like that, right? Well, it's the situation. But for someone like today, if like God were to tell someone, or if someone thought God told them to do this, and there is actually a really sad story, I think a number of years ago, where someone ended up doing something like this, and it wasn't a good result. We have essentially God's word here in the Bible to understand his character and who he is. One of the things that Abraham wrestles with in this whole journey with God is that he's trying to fully understand who God is. As part of the interaction when God is going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah to check out what's happening there, and basically implying he's going to destroy it, Abraham, is very concerned, and he starts essentially testing God's character. Would you lump the righteous in with the wicked? Surely you would never do that. And there's this back and forth between him and God. And Abraham isn't convincing God to change his plan or do anything like that. He's just simply poking and prodding, trying to understand God's character. And you see that in that moment. And God stays true to exactly who he is. And of course, does not lump the righteous in with the wicked when he punishes that place. And so, yeah, so now we have this situation where Abraham doesn't really know God as well as anyone who has the retrospective, stories that we have right here. And part of the story is to show that God isn't like those other deities. That's moving ahead a little bit, a little foreshadowing. Most of you probably know what happens in the story. And we can go ahead and read that part. But basically, this story is to show that who God's character is, and what he kind of requires from it, how he tests us and why. So this isn't what I would call blind faith, right? So there's a big difference between faith, like genuine faith, and blind faith. Blind faith would be something like, well, I guess we'll talk more about that at the end of the story, but I guess that's another thing to think about. The difference between blind faith and actual faith. And so if you're thinking, well, all faith is blind, well, you wouldn't need to add that word to the front of it if all faith was blind, right? Then it would just be faith. So there is a difference between those two things. And this is actually an act of faith that's not blind, and it's very genuine. So Abraham's not acting in a crazy way. He's just simply trusting God. We'll continue from there and go into the next part. All right. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes," Abraham replied, "here I am." I'm going to pause real quick. So this is the angel of the Lord, not just an angel, right? So keep in mind, whenever this comes up, we need to pay attention to this conversation and how this figure speaks. This is one of the mysterious characters in the Old Testament that is widely understood in the essentially context of the whole Bible, that this is the Son of God, not just a mere angel. And part of the reason we understand that is because just listen to the conversation. At first, it's going to sound like a regular angel, but keep in mind, this is going to be the same being talking this entire time. And then listen to how it eventually starts talking, right? So let's go ahead and jump back into that. The angel called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes," Abraham replied, "here I am." "Don't lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not hurt him in any way. For now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son." All right. Did you guys catch that? So first off, God is stopping him, right? Showing that this is not his character. He is not a God who calls for human sacrifice. And kind of explaining why he even did this, testing his character, or testing his faith and obedience. But it starts off with him kind of addressing God as if he's not God, and then speaking directly like he is God. He says that you did not withhold your son from me, right? And why would a mere angel say that? So it's a very, very interesting character here, right? We'll go ahead, kind of go forward from there. Let's get the rest of this scene right here, and then we'll basically jump back into it. Then the angel of the Lord called again to Abraham from heaven. "This is what the Lord says, because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son, I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants beyond number, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies. And through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, all because you have obeyed me." Then they returned to the servants and traveled back to Beersheba, where Abraham continued to live. Ooh, man. All right. So a lot of this has been repeated before. God has promised these things before. And so this is basically, comes down to the question of, well, why does God test someone's character if God knows the future? Like, God knew what Abraham would do, so why put him through this situation? It had to be a very uncomfortable situation to have to be put through, especially for Isaac, I can imagine. So with that, the reason for the testing is that one thing that we learn in the Bible is that the concept of faith is not just something that's in your heart or in your mind. It's not just something that you tell yourself. When someone basically, says something versus what they do, like, what do you actually listen to? Like the saying goes, you never listen to what someone says, you always listen to what they do, and then you'll know the truth, right? You'll know who they actually are. And faith is very much the same way. God allows these tests so that he could bless Abraham because he knows what he's going to do, right? It's going to show the fullness of his character. It's going to make that faith complete. So I read earlier out of Hebrews chapter 11. In that is kind of like the faith hall of fame. It kind of goes through, and Abraham is part of that as well. And it talks about how they basically, responded in faith and committed an action to it, right? Like that faith was complete when they acted on that faith. And that's something that's very, comes up a lot in both the Old and New Testament, this idea of faith and obedience, right? And it's usually kind of all at the same time. So God right here is commending Abraham for being obedient to him. But of course, we know that it's also a big test of faith. Abraham, had to trust God that he would fulfill what it was God had promised to him. And so he just simply did what he was told. And sure enough, God did, exactly what he said he would do. He preserved Isaac, didn't let, anything happen to him. And so, there they go, passed the test. And all those blessings he receives is because God essentially, he had promised it before. God knew his character. And this is basically a way of kind of making it real, right? Like, hey, you were obedient to me. You went through this crazy thing. And if you think about it, for, those who believe in God and that sort of thing, that relationship, is a big part of it is, hey, don't just say something, go and do, right? Go and actually, show that you have faith. Whether the idea is expressed in the New Testament is bearing fruit. Jesus even points to a tree that doesn't bear fruit, and he says, what good is that, right? It has to actually, do the part, not just say the part, but actually walk it, right? So anyways, so yeah, that's kind of what's going on right here. And so in the greater context of blind faith versus regular faith, I would say the difference between those two things, because blind faith is not a good idea, right? Blind faith is the idea that you trust something, maybe like a human source, simply because they said so. Maybe someone you really trust or that sort of thing, or you have a really strongly held belief. Someone asks you to explain it and you go, I don't know how to explain it. I just believe it because so-and-so smart person said so. So that's a blind faith in something, right? You don't actually know the reason or logic behind why you have faith in what you have faith in, the hope in something that is yet unseen, right? So with this situation, Abraham has had many conversations with God. He's seen God do many things. He's seen God follow through with his promises. So this is not some blind faith, action that he's doing. He has a lot of reason to listen to God. He has a lot of reason and past experiences to know that God is going to do what he says, right? If God said, your descendants are going to be through Isaac, then that is what's going to happen. And so he's basically safe to do what God is asking him to do, right? So that's kind of the difference between those two things. And yeah, so we have a little bit more with the story, though. We're going to have an introduction to some other family members, because that's going to be important for the next chapter. So I'll go ahead and read that. It's going to be a bunch of names, but yeah, we'll get through it. It'll be good. Soon after this, Abram heard that, let me repeat that one more time. Soon after this, Abram heard that Milcah, his brother Nahor's wife, had borne Nahor 8 sons. The oldest was named Uz. The next oldest was Buz, followed by Kemuel, the ancestor of the Arameans. There we go. Kesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jiphah, and Bethuel. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. In addition to these 8 sons from Milcah, Nahor had 4 other children from his concubine Rumah. Their names were Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Makkah. There we go. Those will always be a bit of a challenge for me, but the main thing here is just to say that he has essentially distant relatives. His brothers had some children, so these would be his nieces and nephews. And that's going to be important because Isaac is going to end up marrying one of these people. It's going to be Rebecca, right? So we're going to go into that story in the next chapter. I don't know if it's the exact next chapter, but we'll get into that soon, and that's why it's getting brought up here. They kind of keep it somewhat in the family here, so that's just kind of what they did back then. So with that, though, we're going to go ahead. I don't know, Wilson, you good to go back up front and turn the ship around? Because it's not about efficiency. I know if we turn the ship around and turn it back around again, it's not about efficiency. Wilson, let's just go. Sorry. Well, Wilson doesn't want to go through the whole exercise of us basically here. Hold on. Let me make sure we're good right here, and we'll go back to the front of the ship. Let me make sure this happens. There we go. All right, Wilson, let's transition to the front, and we'll wrap the show there. Why'd you turn on the phase warp? I'm sorry, Wilson doesn't want to go through the exercise of us going to the front of the ship and then warping here today. Wilson! All right, fine. Have it your way, Wilson. All right, fine. Here. We'll just lock in right here then. Okay, well, Wilson wants to shortcut it today. So with that, well, that's pretty much the show today. Not very long, but kind of a heavy concept. Pretty interesting. Once again, if you have a voice that tells you to do something like this, just know the Bible has made it very, very clear. God never asked anyone to actually go through with something like this, right? It was a test to Abraham, who didn't know God's character very well, and he was in the process of learning, and this was part of that learning process in that relationship. So yeah. Dan Yoder, thank you, Captain Tom. Very interesting. Glad you guys came. Glad you guys checked it out. Well, next week, we're not going to have a Wednesday show. Instead, there will be a Friday show where we're going to cover a different story, not something from the Bible. It's going to be the first part of the journey to the West, and basically going to summarize like the first it's like 10 or 12 chapters of that. It's about out of 100 chapters. It's a Chinese myth story about the Monkey King, so it should be a lot of fun. And yeah, with that, just basically going to make sure I have enough time to get that set up. A lot goes into the show, so we won't have a Wednesday show next week for that reason, but I hope to see you guys on the Friday show. And with that, all right, we'll hit that intro, or hit that outro. But that'll catch you guys later. You guys have a fantastic rest of your day.
Hold me close till I get out.